All right, what's up, everybody? So I am back. Since I've been away so long, we're not just going to review one video this week for Meta Monday. We have an encore. We got some more. So this is a video that's been around for a long time. You can't see the title here, but I have a link in the description, and it's Inspiring Philosophy. I did a review of one of Inspiring Philosophy's videos, but Inspiring Philosophy, or IP, has a whole series on metaethics. So Travis suggested we review this one, and we're going to go through it. I'm sure I listened to it probably a few years ago, maybe more recently, but I don't remember what's in it. So this will be like, maybe I'll remember it or maybe I won't. But let me also introduce Travis, who's joined me before a few months back to review another video. Welcome, Travis, and you're streaming on your channel too, right?
Yeah.
All right. So I don't really have, like, sometimes I go on some tangent or something. I don't have any today. I'm just ready to get into the video. What about you?
Yeah, me too.
Cool. Okay, so we're just going to get into the video and do our thing, which is commentary, critique. Usually I critique videos like this. Do let me know if you want to pause the video, and I'll pause where I see fit as well. So let's just get started. And we'll have to check the volume, make sure it's good too.
Only true or false.
How does that sound?
Moral relativism is to view moral judgments are only true or false relative to a specific standpoint. This would mean something may be right in India, but wrong in America. Something may be right to you, but wrong to me. No standpoint is said to be privileged or better than any other. All views would be equally valid.
I've already got something to say. Yeah, people, I hear this a lot from people. They'll say, on moral relativism, all views are equally valid. I'm not exactly sure what people mean when they say all views, what they mean when they say valid.
I have the same concern. Let me get it off this pause because I don't like it being halfway in the middle of something. In fact, I'll start it back because he's very abrupt with this. That's better. Moral relativism. Okay. Yeah. So, in philosophy, valid or validity has this specific technical use in the context of logic, where you have a valid argument when it's structured properly. It doesn't mean the conclusion of the argument is true. It's just that if the premises of the argument are true, then the conclusion is true, or probably true if it's inductive or whatever. It has to do with having the sort of proper structure of an argument. You would say this is a valid argument. Now, of course, valid and validity have colloquial uses and non-technical uses of various kinds. Like I might say, oh, well, I think your perspective on this issue is just as valid as my own, even if I disagree with you. And that might be something that might be a way of, in part, expressing politeness or respect or tolerance for another person's view. It might carry epistemic import. You might say, well, I think I'm correct, but I think you stand an equal or plausible chance of being correct, something like that. So there's all sorts of connotations and associations in colloquial use with valid. But why say each moral position is equally valid? What does that mean in this specific context? I see this repeated over and over and over by critics of relativism, but they don't typically, like you would typically say, two conflicting positions are equally correct or equally true about what's morally right or wrong. Why do they specifically shift towards using the term valid in this context? I don't know what they mean, and it looks like sort of a repetition.
He does say explicitly, he says, on relativism, no view is privileged or better than another. Which, I mean, like, what exactly is meant by better there? Because, I mean, it's true. I mean, I suppose technically, I was going to say that it would be true that it's not objectively better, but actually even that you could quibble with. Because, technically you could be a relativist while still being a realist. But I mean, assuming someone is an anti-realist and a relativist, yeah, they're going to say that, there's no objectively better moral views. But there's nothing stopping someone from saying, like, one moral view is better than a different moral view, like within, like from a given standpoint.
Yeah, they use better there in a way. This is not just inspiring philosophy, but critics in general. No one view is better than another view. Okay, well, better in a relative sense or a non-relative sense, because I certainly think my moral views are better than everybody else's. That's why I endorse them. But even if that sounds a little strained, I could say I think the moral standards of some cultures are better than others because I approve of them more. They're like better relative to my own moral standards. So there's no real issue at all with saying that you're a relativist and you think some views are better than others. You know, like what to just take a person that's a gastronomic anti-realist who's a relativist about food preferences. So when I say pineapple on pizza is good, it is good in a certain sense, because what I mean is I like the taste of pineapple on pizza. And if you say you don't like it, you're right, because you're saying something about it being bad relative to your standards. Does that mean I can't say some restaurants are better than others? That'd be really bizarre. Like they could be better relative to my preferences, obviously. So this idea that, and I don't have to think all restaurant reviews are equally good or equally valid or equally legitimate, because I can judge other people's reviews of restaurants relative to my own gastronomic standards and other sorts of standards of politeness. If someone says this restaurant sucks, I might think that's a worse review. And a better review says I ordered my food, it took 12 minutes for it to arrive, and they get really specific details. There's no problem with evaluating things with respect to relative standards, like at all. It's not like the words better and worse only have meaning in non-relative context. So this is a very strange thing for people to say. More to add, or should we?
Yeah, that's all I have to say about that part.
Cool. Okay, let's go.
Moral relativism is to view moral judgments are only true or false relative to a specific standpoint.
As an aside, there's a minor ambiguity here. Moral judgments are only true or false relative to a specific standpoint is ambiguous between moral truth claims can vary. They could be true relative to this standard or that standard or some other standard, and there being a specific standard, and all moral claims are true or false relative to that one specific standard. That would technically not be a type of relativism. That would be something like a relation designating account, like ideal observer theory, because you could say on ideal observer theory, all moral claims are true or false relative to the standard of a single, fully informed, perfectly rational standpoint that sets the bar for what's morally right or wrong. It'd be a little weird to say relative to, because moral claims are no longer really indexed. There's only one correct standard. But this alludes to what you were referencing earlier, that technically relativism is it's actually consistent with realism in certain incarnations, because the stance-dependent, stance-independent axis can come apart from the indexical, non-indexical axis.
This would mean something may be right in India, but wrong in America. Something may be right to you, but wrong to me. No standpoint is said to be privileged or better than any other. All views would be equally valid. Unlike non-cognitivism, moral relativism accepts moral claims are true.
He says there, one thing might be right in India and wrong in America, or something like that, I believe. It's kind of like ambiguous, like as to what he means there. Because you could say, okay, on like if you're a cultural relativist, like one thing is, maybe right relative to the standards of India and wrong relative to the standards of America. But, it should be noted that's different from having like a normative position where you think like the permissibility of an action like depends on the location where it's being performed. Like if someone does it in India, then it's okay. But if they like are in the United States and they do it, then all of a sudden it's wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't actually know which position he has in mind. Does he have in mind a sort of cultural appraiser relativism where the same action would be right or wrong pretty much everywhere relative to the standards of India, but the opposite relative to the standards of the United States? Or does he have in mind that like whether your action is right or wrong is in fact like relative to your geographic location. What do you think? I can't tell from this.
I don't know. A lot of times when people criticize relativism, they seem to have in mind like this idea that it depends, like the morality of an action is like dependent on like your culture, where you live, like in the sense of like, oh, well, if these people are in this culture and they are fine with doing this, then it's just fine, period. We have to leave them alone. We have to like respect them. We can't criticize them. I mean, that's what a lot of the critiques of relativism I see, they tend to like embed like that normative element in it. So I would imagine something like that is what he's getting at.
What's weird about that is that's a normative position, not exclusively a metaethical one.
Yeah, I mean, there's this weird idea that people have, and it's very bizarre how common it is, because you don't just see like lay people saying this. You even see professional philosophers saying this a lot of the times, that if you're a relativist, you must accept this normative implication. You must it entails this value of tolerance to like other individuals or other cultures. And it's just like, well, where is that all of a sudden coming from?
Yeah, it's a strange thing. That might be an implication of certain types of relativism, and this will probably come out as we discuss this, not all of them, and not the one that predominates in, like, for instance, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on moral relativism. There's another kind of relativism. So we may or may not get to that, but we'll see where the video goes before we do that.
Or false, but simply doesn't claim they would be objectively true or false. Truth is decided on different levels by different individuals or cultures or ethnic groups. In popular culture, this appears to have become a dominant view. We often hear people preface statements with, "Well, I personally believe this," or say things like, "It feels right to me," and "We all need to figure out what is true for each of us." These are symptoms of a culture that has been founded on moral relativistic views. The question I want to ask is if there is evidence and good reason moral relativism is true, or if there are problems with this line of thinking in metaethics. Moral relativism has been critiqued by several philosophers who have demonstrated it suffers from several problems. Let's begin by first looking at agent relativism. Remember, agent relativism says...
That's interesting. He is actually making the distinction. Well, I will absolutely give credit to Inspiring Philosophy for actually explicitly mentioning agent and appraiser relativism. I don't remember if he mentions appraiser, and I don't remember this. So that's cool. Any thoughts on that? That's actually interesting. Almost nobody does that. So good job.
Yeah, usually when I see people go after relativism, a lot of the times they don't even mention that there is a distinction between agent and appraiser relativism. They don't mention, oh, here are these two different like strains of relativism. Here's what this one says, is what the other one says. They just don't like mention it at all. And they just like attack like relativism as a whole without ever mentioning that. So
yeah, I'm working on a blog post on an academic publication that explicitly does this. It just talks about relativism, and the only description it gives is agent relativism, and it never mentions appraiser relativism. We'll see.
Do they even mention like, oh, agent relativism, or do they just call it like a relativism?
No, they just call it relativism. And I've seen several professional philosophers do it. This is a professional philosopher. It's a book on bioethics. And they say a whole bunch of stuff in there. One of the funny things that they say in that book, it's like a Oxford University Press, like a major textbook for students and stuff. So I was surprised to see all this in there. This basically like really contemptuous take on relativism. But it also says something like this. It says relativism is like understandably like a comforting idea because it gets rid of the need to have to think seriously about morality.
Yeah. There was one paper I saw that it was you actually wrote an article responding to it. It was by Dustin Crummett. And I think it was Dustin Crummett and some other person. I'm blanking on the other person's name. But they said something in the paper like, oh, if you're a relativist, if a slave owner thinks that slavery is okay, then slavery is okay. And, that's just really counterintuitive. And since relativism has this obviously false implication, then relativism must be false. And I actually had an exchange with Dustin Crummett on Twitter about that line in the paper. And I said, well, hold on. Like, if you're a relativist, you're not necessarily committed to, if a slave owner thinks slavery is okay, then it must be okay, like simpliciter. You can say, oh, well, it would be okay relative to their standards, but still wrong, very wrong relative to mine. And to Dustin Crummett's credit, he did acknowledge in that Twitter exchange that, yeah, that was an error in the paper, that my characterization was, in a more accurate way of putting it. But, I wish that nuance would have been in the paper itself, instead of a kind of like after the fact correction on Twitter.
Yeah, well, credit to him for acknowledging that. I linked the blog post. It's called "Let There Be Realism: A Critique of Crummett and Swinson." I don't actually know who Swinson is. I just was critiquing the paper. I have previously critiqued Crummett, but I have some dim recollection of it just seeming to be like, yeah, relativism is agent relativism. Let's critique it. But if you acknowledge that, hey, a blog you can update. If a paper is published, a paper is published, so it's kind of stuck that way. So that's kind of an unfortunate feature of that. But
and as really cool. As you've noted a few times as well, it's also really weird that people like frame it as only agent relativism. When if you look at the SEP page on relativism, like according to the SEP, they say that appraiser relativism is actually the more popular form of relativism. So it's kind of bizarre that like everyone wants to just focus on agent relativism.
Right. So a couple things about that. So I've seen that line. I think is that Gowans. I don't know how to say the name, but it's the entry on moral relativism, and it says
I don't know who the author is.
Let's look it up. We got the internet right here. Moral relativism. Yeah, Chris Goins. I'm going to look up more common so we can get the exact quote. Let's see, agent. Okay, here is the exact quote. That to which truth or justification is relative may be the persons making the moral judgments or the persons about whom the judgments are made. These are sometimes called appraiser and agent relativism, respectively. Appraiser relativism suggests that we do or should make moral judgments on the basis of our own standards, while agent relativism implies that the relevant standards are those of the persons we are judging. Of course, in some cases, these may coincide. Appraiser relativism is the more common position, and it will usually be assumed in the discussion that follows. So that's from that remark, and so it like from that article. And so insofar as people consider that authoritative, I agree with you that it's a little unusual. Note, though, that there's no reference for that. How did the author judge that appraiser is more common than agent relativism? I don't actually know what that's based on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's any actual empirical data on it. I mean, I would assume probably what they did is just based on their like reading of papers or works by relativists. They saw appraiser relativism, as the more commonly like argued position among that. I would assume that's what they were basing it off of. But yeah, I don't know that there's any like, survey of philosophers asking, out of these types of relativism, which one do you endorse? I mean, relativism isn't even endorsed. It's not even mentioned on like the Phil paper survey. They have a question on metaethics, and you see like, non-naturalist realism, naturalist realism, error theory, expressivism. There's no mention of relativism or subjectivism at all.
They did include constructivism, and maybe the expectation was that relativists would roll themselves into that, but I'm not sure what the expectation was. According to the authors of the survey, they consulted specialists within the fields in designing the questions that were most relevant to those fields. So maybe metaethicists said, yeah, just lump relativists in with constructivists, but I'm not sure everybody answering the survey, especially non-metaethicists, would have rolled with that or understood that. So that might be a structural design flaw in the response options given. Because you're right, I do think that's a weird component of the survey that some explicit reference to relativism isn't mentioned. And of course, you're going to get this at least 4 types of relativism, because you're going to have the agent and appraiser axis and the individual and cultural axis. And you could, in principle, have other types of relativism. You could have like species relativism or other, you could relativize standards in some other way. So who knows? I don't know what the thinking behind that was. But yeah, so one thing to say is that it's not clear that that's actually true. The other is to speculate on why critics of relativism tend to focus on agent relativism. And a couple things, I think. One is, I think, just inertia. I think people tend to well, okay, there's a few considerations. One is that agent relativism might more closely resemble the popular, like, folk relativism out there, like like one that's not considered an intellectually rigorous or serious view. And so that's the misconception that they want to correct. That's the one that sort of permeates the sociocultural zeitgeist, and they want to pick up on and critique that. That might be part of it. Part of it might be that's what they were taught in school, so they're just sort of repeating the stuff that they've been told. And the third, and this one is a little bit of psychologizing, and I don't like doing that, but it is plausible that, hey, of the two, one of them is pretty easy to say, if you're an agent relativist, you have to be okay with people stealing from you, you have to be okay with genocide or whatever. That's implausible. That's a stupid view.
Yeah, they find all the worst things possible that you can think of, and you're like, if you're a relativist, you have to be okay with this.
Right, but of course that's not true if you're an appraiser relativist. You don't have to be okay with anything you don't approve of. So that might make it, sorry, rhetorically less effective to target appraiser relativism. So there could be some motivated reasoning going on here. You pick on the easier one to pick on.
As morality is defined by the individual. So each person will have moral views that are true to them, and every person's moral views would be equally right on the individual level. So this would mean all motivating reasons for morality would be internal, since they all come from the individual. Nothing external can motivate moral behavior, simply because morality is defined and created by the internal motives of each agent. So this would stand in contrast to something like moral realism, which says objective moral facts and duties exist externally to the agent, which motivate agents to act in a certain way. In moral realism, external reasons motivate. Under agent relativism, only internal reasons can motivate, since there is no moral truth or standard outside of each agent, for those who hold there are only internal reasons and that there are no external reasons. However, if we can show external reasons can motivate, this would pose a problem for agent relativism, and there seems to be arguments which we can use to show this. Consider an example. Perhaps there is a grumpy old man who automatically assumes his neighbors are mean and out to get him.
About
However,
this, I kind of find this like a weird characterization of agent relativism, because like the way he's describing it, like at the beginning he says, on agent relativism, morality is relative to the individual. And I kind of would take the, individual versus cultural relative distinction to be separate from the appraiser versus agent relativism distinction. So he seems to just be like lumping the two together.
Yeah, and then there's, I don't know, so it sounds like he's talking about, we make the distinction between individual versus cultural. It sounds like he's focusing specifically on individual agent relativism rather than agent relativism in contrast to appraiser relativism. I tend to just drop all the references to cultural relativism when I talk about stuff for ease of like articulation, because otherwise you have to say, okay, technically there's 4 positions here: agent individual relativism, agent cultural relativism, appraiser individual relativism, appraiser cultural relativism. And if you have to keep going back and forth repeating within each subset, the two that you're focused on, that's a little awkward and superfluous. So I don't have a huge problem with the focus specifically on agent individual relativism, unless he's actually conflating the two. But
yeah, because to me it seems like he's conflating the two.
You think?
Yeah, because like at the beginning, I mean, I think if I'm recalling correctly, he said like on agent relativism, morality is relative to the individual.
Yeah, and that's agent individual relativism, not agent cultural relativism.
Yeah.
So that it's just one of the axes has been dropped. But note too that technically relativism is about what it is that makes moral claims true, and it specifically holds that moral claims are indexicalized as opposed to views that hold that they're not indexicalized, and that's actually consistent with realism. So someone could think, for instance, this is kind of weird, but you could think that whether an action is morally right or wrong, for instance, is determined by your astrological sign. And so then you get like a type of relativism, but it's not stance dependent because it's not up to your stances, what you're like, whether you're a Gemini or whatever, or a Sagittarius. And so whether an action is right or wrong is indexed to like your birth sign or something like that, your star sign. So you have relativism, you don't have stance dependence. And so the stance dependence independence axis comes apart from the relativism non-relativism axis. And it really has to do with whether moral claims are indexed or not. That distinction isn't commonly picked up on by hardly anyone. So I tend to give it a pass, largely because the two views tend to coincide in practice almost all of the time. I don't think I've ever heard of a non-indexical, like a person that endorses relativism, but doesn't make it stance dependent. I've never heard of that. It's logically possible. And I don't mean logically possible. I was going to say, I don't mean logically possible in a way where it's like totally impossible. Like, yeah, someone could relativize things in a weird way. It's not like that far-fetched. Anyway, you're saying?
Oh yeah, I was going to say, I wonder if there are any academics who defend a kind of like realist relativism. Because I don't know.
David Wong. David Wong has a hybrid view. So Wong holds that there are basically moral standards can be true or false relative to different societies, but there are constraints. So 2 different societies could both have equally like true relative to their own moral frameworks, moral standards that conflict with one another, as long as they don't conflict with or violate certain overarching norms that they would both be subject to. So you could have 2 different cultures that have different ways of resolving conflict in nonviolent ways, but you couldn't, and both are equally true. So in one society, they say it's morally permissible to put people in prison. The other say it's morally permissible to rehabilitate people. Both societies' moral claims are true, even if relative to the other ones, they would be false. But then it wouldn't be the case that you could have a society where it's morally permissible to like torture criminals to death. Those statements would all be false. So it's kind of like a relativism nested within a realism, at least as far as I understand it. I'm not like a scholar of that work. And that's kind of a hybrid view. It's like realism within relativism kind of thing.
I see.
I never see anyone talk about that view. It's unfortunate. Whenever you get interesting hybrid or more sophisticated views, not a lot of people talk about them, like quasi-realism.
Yeah, I actually read a paper just the other day talking about different forms of relativism. They didn't mention like any realist versions, but they did mention there were a few different ones. One view that they refer to as metaethical contextualism, and then another one that they called like new wave relativism. So yeah.
Do you recall in what ways they differed from the kinds of relativism we're talking about here?
Yeah, so metaethical contextualism, the idea is on that view. So when someone makes a moral statement, let's just focus on individual to keep it simple. But like, let's say, on individual contextualism, when someone makes a moral judgment, it's not just a description of their attitudes like it would be on like a typical individual subjectivism. Instead, the idea is it's not a description of your attitudes, but what the moral statement refers to. It's fixed by your attitudes in some way. So, for example, if you're a utilitarian and you say, like, eating meat is wrong, that doesn't translate to, I disapprove of eating meat. It translates to, eating meat fails to maximize utility. And if you're like a virtue ethicist or deontologist and you make a statement, it would like translate to something about like those. So like the properties the statement is about, that's fixed by whatever you happen to value, is the idea.
Okay.
And then new wave relativism. To be honest, I don't completely understand this view, but on new wave relativism, the idea is that when someone says like eating meat is wrong, another person says no, eating meat is fine, they're actually, in both of those cases, they're expressing the exact same proposition. And so the truth value, it's just that the proposition has like differing truth values. Like, so it's the same proposition, but it's true relative to this person's framework, but false relative to this other person's framework. That's the idea.
Huh. I don't get it from that description. I guess I'd have to go read the paper.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. All right. So let's get back to this video. So I'll take it back a few seconds just so we can get.
One day a family moves in next door and is.
Where's the back button?
Used to show this.
Okay.
Consider an example. Perhaps there's a.
Oh, real quick. This is supposed to be an example showing what? That there actually are external reasons. That's what the purpose of this is, right? Let's take it back.
Maybe we should go back a bit.
Truth a certain way. In moral realism, external reasons motivate. Under agent relativism, only internal reasons can motivate, since there is no moral truth or standard outside of each agent, for those who hold there are only internal reasons and that there are no external reasons. However, if we can show external reasons can motivate, this would pose a problem for agent relativism, and there seems to be arguments which we can use to show this. Consider an example.
Real quick, I just remember this example being really weird and completely unconvincing to me, and that's all I remember about it.
Perhaps there is a grumpy old man who automatically assumes his neighbors are mean and out to get him. However, one day a family moves in next door and is very nice to him. They bake him food and help him with his yard work and do everything they can to help him as their elder. After a while, the old man changes his attitude and is no longer grumpy, but is nice and kind to the family. The question we must ask is if the motivation to change his attitude was external or internal. Before the family moved in.
That's so weird. How would we know? Like, isn't that an empirical question? Like whether he, like, what caused him to change his attitude? My immediate response would be, he had a certain position. Like, I don't like my neighbors. He has good neighbors. That information caused him to go, I was incorrect about disliking neighbors. These neighbors are good. Then he changed his mind in response to that factual information. Nothing about that at any point seems to involve external reasons. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. Seems bizarre.
Well, let's see where he takes this.
Dan, could the old man have decided on his own to be nice to his neighbors? Arguably, this wasn't possible. When the family first approached him,
Why is that not possible? So is the idea that his neighbor, he doesn't like neighbors. His neighbors show up, and it's not possible prior to them being nice to him for him to choose to like his neighbors. So he just doesn't like neighbors, and he hasn't been given any new information, so he just can't change his mind. The same way, like, if I went outside, it's raining, I can't just decide to believe it's not raining. It's evident that it's raining. But if it stopped raining, that might cause me to go, oh, it's no longer raining. So, or if someone can convince me it was an elaborate illusion, I might go, oh, it's not reading. But until there's some outside cause that prompts you to change your mind, then maybe the idea, like this might be a very deterministic view, which is maybe ironic, coming from inspiring philosophy, that you don't have voluntary control over your motivations or something. I don't know. I don't have a huge problem with that, but I just don't see how this is going to get into external reasons.
Oh, well,
he was angry and
he
distant. So the challenge to agent relativism is that if we think the old man did have a reason to be nice, but there was no way for him to be motivated to change on his own, then we can infer he had a normative reason that was external to him.
I don't get it. How does that follow? Let me just hear the whole thing. Sorry, this is what I...
So the evidence would say there are external reasons, and thus show there are external normative factors.
Wait, what is the evidence? Where did he show that? So take it back.
As Ruth's shape of reason is that if we think
okay,
man changes his attitude.
So let's go through this whole scenario and ask yourself, okay, so first of all, so an internal reason on this account would be something like some motivation that you have, some desire that you have, a goal that you have. There's something like you're motivated by your goals and desires, but you could have external reasons. Reasons are on the, like, it's hard to give and explain what the hell an external reason is supposed to be. It's supposed to be some consideration or fact that counts in favor of you doing something like holding a particular attitude or performing a particular action. Would you characterize external reasons any differently than that?
No, I mean, that seems like a fine way of characterizing it.
That's what Parfit says. Parfit says external reasons are what count in favor of performing an action in a way that's not reducible to or identifiable with your desires, your goals, or other sorts of internal psychological states. There are reasons that are like out there that provide what another way people might say is they provide reasons for action. So the reason provides you with a reason for action. Like it's supposed to count towards doing something. And the fact that it counts towards doing something cannot be described in terms of it promoting your goals or furthering your interests or being in accord with your desires or attitudes or preferences. That's what an external reason is supposed to be. So we're going to go through this scenario again and ask yourself, at what point in the scenario with this old man coming to like his neighbors, should we think that there are external reasons at any point to explain what's going on here? I have a few things to say about this, but this is weird and it strikes me as confused in ways that are so bizarre, it's hard to even articulate just how weird and confused they seem to me to be.
Moves in next door and is very nice to him. They bake him food and help him with his yard work and do everything they can to help him as their elder. After a while, the old man changes his attitude and is no longer grumpy, but is nice and kind to the family. The question we must ask is if the motivation to change his attitude was external or internal. Before the family moved.
So there's something really strange about this. If the motivation to change his attitude was external, internal, whether he had an external motivation, what exactly does he mean by an external motivation here? Does he mean that the guy had a certain attitude and then causal fact, like events caused him to change his attitude? And so that counts as an external motivation? Is that even, that's not what an external motivation is. It's not what an external reason is. An external reason isn't a like completely mundane descriptive fact about the world that prompts you to change your attitudes or beliefs. Like, let's say I like a person, I trust them. Then I find out they're like a serial killer or something. And so I stop liking the person. Is the discovery that they're a serial killer an external reason? And so that means there's external reasons? That's ridiculous. Or imagine I'm eating a sandwich and then I find out that the chef spit in it. So I go, ew, gross. And then I don't like it anymore. I was liking it before. Does that give me an external reason? But the sorts like external reasons are not descriptive causal facts. They're irreducibly normative. And yet what he's describing here is just a series of causal events. You have a guy that doesn't like neighbors. He gets good neighbors. The fact that they're good neighbors causes him to reappraise them and stop disliking having neighbors. This is just a set of descriptive facts. At what point do normative reasons enter into the picture at all? And note, he shifts the language over to normativity. Where did the normativity enter into this? This just looks like a bunch of descriptive psychological stuff. This is super weird. The impression I have is that he doesn't know what an external reason is, like at all. And he never gives a description or explains what the heck they're supposed to be in the first place. I don't know. What do you think? I just find that so bizarre.
Yeah, and also, like, if this is how he's choosing to characterize it, I don't see why he would think, like, a relativist would deny that. Like, does he think that, like, a relativist would say, like, oh, a person, if his neighbors are really nice to him, that can't make him change. That can't make him change his view on his neighbors. I don't really get what he's going
No,
for
a
here.
relativist wouldn't say that. I think that inspiring philosophy does not understand the distinction between internal and external reasons. It seems like he thinks an internal reason is like when you're motivated to hold an attitude, act a certain way, or think a certain way without any external input or stimulus. Like you just have an attitude and then you can change the attitude to another attitude and nothing has to prompt the change. So you could like a person, and if you have an internal motivation, then you could just not like, I don't like them anymore. And it's like, well, why don't you like them? I could just choose not to like them. I have the power. Like that's what it seems like he thinks an internal motivation is. So then naturally, in contrast, an external motivation is when I actually can't do that. Hey, I have a friend. I like my friend. I trust my friend. I can't just go, I don't like them anymore. They would have to like do something like smack me in the face and say, I hate you. I'm not your friend anymore. And then I could dislike my friend. So then that's giving me an external reason. But that's not what the internal external reason distinction is about. It's not about whether what causes you to have an attitude is some sort of purely psychological internal phenomenon that doesn't dynamically engage with the world around you, or whether it's caused by some sort of set of events. That's just not what the distinction is. I think this is just him straight up not understanding the distinction at like a fundamental level. That's really weird.
Dan, could the old man have decided on his own to be nice to his neighbors?
You see, like, well, how the hell is that possibly relevant? Whether he could have decided on his own, that just has nothing to do with it. And I like your point, because what does he think a relativist would say in response to this? Would they say, nope, nobody can change, nobody changes their minds in response to external stimuli. They only ever change their mind like in some weird sui generis way that has nothing to do with the outside world. What the hell? What does that have to do with relativism?
Yeah, I have
arguably
no idea what he's going for at all with this, but I don't know. Maybe it'll be more clear later.
Well, I've seen this several times. It doesn't become clear later.
Possible. When the family first approached him, he was angry and distant. So the challenge to agent relativism is that if we think the old man did have a reason to be nice.
So no, the challenge to agent relativism is if we think we have a reason to be nice, but there is no way for him to be motivated to change on his own. There was no way for him to be motivated to change on his own. It took those experiences. Again, this has nothing to do with the internal external reason distinction at all. He doesn't. Yeah, I'm going to just say, I bang the gavel, case decided. He doesn't understand the distinction. But also, the problem is that if we think if we think he has external reasons in the sense that would be a threat to agent relativism, then it's a problem for agent relativism. Okay, so think about what the objection is. Hey, according to this view, there are no external reasons. Well, I gave you an example. If you think in this example that there are external reasons, that's a problem for a view according to which there are not external reasons. Well, no shit, that's a problem if you think there's external reasons. It's a problem for a view that according to which there are no external reasons. Like if this actually were a threat to agent relativism, wouldn't they just respond by saying, okay, but I don't think he has external reasons? Why would they buy into that? What the hell? Like the criticism is that we think otherwise. I don't understand what the criticism is supposed to be. So weird.
But there was no way for him to be motivated to change on his own. Then we can infer yet a normative reason that was external to him. So the evidence would say there are external reasons, and thus show there.
No, he moved from if we think this is a problem. to saying the evidence is that there are these things. What? Did you catch that? Oh, you might be muted.
Oh, no, I was going to say, can you play it again over?
Now I was muted. Absolutely. Watch what he does. So he gives this scenario. I guess it's supposed to be a thought experiment that's supposed to prompt you to think that he might have, the grumpy man in the scenario might have external reasons. Then he says, the problem is that if you think that he has external reasons, this is going to be a problem. And then his very next slide, he says, and so the evidence would say that there are external reasons. How did he go from if you think this is evidence, then it's a problem, to it is evidence? What? So I'll replay it so you can see.
There are external. So the challenge to agent relativism is that if we think the old man did have a reason to be nice, but there was no way for him to be motivated to change on his own, then we can infer yet a normative reason that was external to him. So the evidence would say there are external reasons.
So he says, so the evidence would suggest. So if we think this, it's a problem. So the evidence is that it is a problem.
Yeah, strange.
Maybe by the if we think this is a problem, he's just supposing that we will think it's a problem. And so he's taking off
he's kind of just taking it for granted that people are going to agree with his analysis.
So I don't think it's a non sequitur. I just think it's badly phrased.
Yeah.
I think he's saying, hey, here's a thought experiment. I think the proper reaction to this thought experiment is to think he does have an external reason. That's evidence against agent relativism. I think that's the more charitable interpretation.
Yeah.
Well, he needs to work on his wording then. But do you have any other? Sorry, I paused this so many times. It's just this
no.
part just puzzles me so immensely.
No, okay. I don't have anything else to add.
Okay, I'm going to keep going then.
External normative factors. As Ruth Schaefer-Landau says, it is true of many different kinds of people that if they were somehow to look beyond the picture of things they have grown used to, they would find themselves with an outlook, a plan of life, and a set of circumstances that they would find more valuable than they could ever have imagined. In such cases, realizing the relevant benefits often requires a change of character. The goodness available only to those who make such changes may be so valuable as to make it true that one has, despite one's present motivations, a reason to make necessary changes.
That gives a little more context to it. In spite of one's present motivations. So what's weird about this is that this is going to be a pretty serious problem for a critic of agent relativism, because an agent relativist does not have to think or construe human psychology in terms of something like one's reasons for action are determined by, because note what he says here, present motivations, as though everything about what's morally right or wrong for one has to be at this very surface level. And if it's not at a surface level, then it's what? Stance independent and non-relativistic. That's a little weird, because that grumpy man might hold the view, I don't like my neighbors, and I don't like neighbors more generally. So I'm not going to like these neighbors. I want to avoid them. Now, is it a problem for a relativist to say, actually, he has a reason to get along with his neighbors? That sounds like I don't know if I said relativism or realism. Would it be a problem for relativism to say, although this man does not like his neighbors, doesn't want to interact with them, and will try to avoid them, that he actually does have a reason to hang out with his neighbors? That's not really a threat to relativism. Why? Well, because relativism holds that moral claims, agent relativism, are fixed by the attitudes, preferences, standards, and values of the individual. But human psychology is not so simple that if you have some instrumental attitude, like, I don't like my neighbors and I don't want to interact with them, therefore it's in my interest to not interact with them, that you don't necessarily have higher order or implicit attitudes about what would be in your interests. So you might think, I don't like my neighbors because neighbors are annoying and frustrating and bad and exploitative and they're loud and everything. And you could be factually mistaken about that. And actually, what you really want is people who aren't like that as neighbors. And so it would be inconsistent with relative to your own values to say you actually do have a reason to get along with these neighbors. You have factually mistaken beliefs about the properties or nature of your neighbors. Take, for instance, if you're a relativist and your goal is to quench your thirst, and I hold a glass of clear liquid in front of you, and I'm like, hey, here's a glass of water. Now, you have a goal, quench your thirst, and you now have an instrumental goal, drink that glass of water to quench your thirst. But what if I lied and it's not water? It's actually some type of acid or something that's not going to quench your thirst at all. In fact, it's going to harm you greatly. So we could say in that case that although you're still a relativist about the matter, you actually have you want to drink the glass of water, but you actually have a reason not to. And that reason is in a certain sense external to your sort of a proximal desire to drink the glass of water. What it's not external to is your desire to quench your thirst. Actually, whether or not it's in your interest to drink that glass of water only makes sense relative to your overarching goal of quenching your thirst. And in the case of the grumpy man, this person, we could say, wants to be happy or wants to have good neighbors or something like that. They have some overarching set of values, goals, or preferences that maybe they don't even realize about themselves, or they have mistaken factual beliefs about what means would be in the service to those overarching goals, and they're just wrong about what would achieve those goals. This is trying to construe these situations as though what's morally right or wrong for a person is determined entirely by their proximal instrumental motivations and not by their sort of overall, like holistically considered an overarching set of goals and motivations. And it gives this really shallow picture of human psychology that a relativist is not required to endorse.
Yeah. I mean, also, there are also other forms of relativism that are kind of idealized versions. There are some forms of relativism where it's like according to what your attitudes would be, like if you were fully informed or upon reflection. You know, those are other varieties of relativism as well.
Right, and so you could have something like Humean constructivism or something like that. If the critique here is supposed to be, and I don't think you have to be some kind of non-relativist to hold a view like that. So in these sorts of cases, what I would say is just that facts about human psychology they don't ratchet nicely into simple categories like moral facts are determined by your quote unquote motivations, as if motivations couldn't exist in a hierarchy or interact with one another. They might even be internally inconsistent. So a whole lot of psychologically interesting things could be going on with a person, but the bottom line is that a person can have factually mistaken beliefs about what would or wouldn't serve their interests. They can base instrumental desire and proximal desires or goals on the basis of those, and they could just be wrong about them. And so then, contrary to their own attitudes or beliefs, they in a sense have reasons to do things or hold certain attitudes or act in certain ways. We can still ask whether that reason is external to their goal. It's not reducible to their goals or desires. And in this case, it certainly seems viable to me that it turns out that it is in the interests of and is consistent with the goals and desires of the grumpy man to have, come to like his neighbors and start appreciating them. So I don't really see a problem here. Now, it's possible that a person can have, like, all things considered, have certain sorts of values, and then you could say, but what if the facts cause them to change their attitudes in that case? But there's still a psychological question here, which is this. Let's say he actually has as like an axiomatic value. It's not an instrumental value. Neighbors suck, I hate neighbors. And so he has no reason to like his neighbors. Okay, so even in that case, so even in the worst case scenario for the relativist, where it's not even the case that they just have some instrumental or like lower order value, and so and like that runs into conflict with the scenario that we've been given with the grumpy man, but they have some higher order value where it actually is good relative to their values to start getting along with their neighbors. Set aside that issue and just say, nope, the person actually just hates their neighbors all the way to the core. Okay, so what actually happened in this scenario? The person hates their neighbors. And so we could say for the agent relativist, What they have reason to do is avoid their neighbors, dislike their neighbors, and so on and so forth. In spite of those desires, in spite of what is in their interests at the time, it's in their interest to avoid their neighbors. It's actually good relative to their genuine values to avoid their neighbors. They nevertheless interact with their neighbors. And when they do interact with their neighbors, their attitude starts to change. So what's the causal story here? Is it that some normative facts caused them to have reasons to change their mind, and then they change their mind in response to the normative facts? Or alternatively, is it that certain descriptive facts change their psychology, the psychology changes their attitudes, and to the extent that they come to value and appreciate interacting with their neighbors, that simply comes along for the ride with the shift in the descriptive facts and the shift in their psychology. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I co-sign that.
I'll try to give an example. Let's say you hate a certain kind of food and you've tasted it, you don't like it. Someone says it's an acquired taste, and you go, I don't care, I don't want to eat it. And so we say, as a gastronomic subjectivist, you actually have no reason to eat the food. Nevertheless, you get stuck on a desert island where it's the only thing to eat. And so you eat it and you eat it and you eat it and you hate it, but then you hate it a little less and you hate it a little less and you hate it a little less. And then at a certain point it shifts and you start to like it. Does that mean that there are external gastronomic reasons that give you reason to eat the food independent of your desires? No, because we could still ask that's one possibility in principle, I guess. But there's another causal story here, which is that the act of eating the food you don't like over and over and over actually caused psychological changes that changed your attitudes. And your attitudes can still fix what you have reason to do. It's just the attitudes themselves change in response to descriptive facts, not external reasons. In other words, not normative reasons. In other words, what I'm suggesting here is that descriptive facts can do the attitude changing work, and then the attitude changing work can continue to do the norm fixing work in a stance dependent and relativistic way, rather than us proposing that there are external reasons to account for the changes. Sorry if that got a little sophisticated.
Yeah, I remember I also gave. Oh,
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I remember also I gave an example, a similar kind of example involving food, where it was like you have this child, and, they think, oh, like, I don't like broccoli. I don't want to eat broccoli. I never want to put broccoli in my mouth ever, ever, ever. And maybe they're just mistaken about, what they think about broccoli. Like maybe they've only had it like steamed with no seasoning, and they don't like that. But like they would like, broccoli prepared in like other ways. So like even like internally, like relative to their own kind of like tastes, they might have like reason to still eat like broccoli prepared in other ways.
That's a great example, and it reminds me of something I put in my dissertation where I critiqued a perspective very similar to this, and I pointed out that the fact that we can have reasons to do things even if they're inconsistent with our desires, but that this in no way entails stance independence. In other words, in this case, like irreducibly normative external reasons for doing things, that it's still consistent with relativism. We could get this lesson literally from books we read to children. And the book that comes to mind is Dr. Seuss, Green Eggs and Ham. I mean, the whole point of the book is this person is saying, I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam I am. I would not eat them in a box. I would not eat them with the box and all that nonsense. And then finally, he's just persuaded through sheer annoyance. Like, look, if you'll just stop annoying me, I'll try it. And what does he find out? What does he discover? He discovers he does like green eggs and ham. So is that a case of him discovering stance-independent gastronomic facts? No. It's a case of him discovering something about his own preferences. He thinks he doesn't like it, and he may sincerely believe that. And then he discovers he's actually mistaken about that. Maybe the appearance of green eggs and ham was so gross, he mistakenly believed it wouldn't taste good. Ultimately, though, what is it that is going on when he discovers that it tastes good? He's discovering something about his own preferences. And it's the same thing with this old man. This old man can discover that actually he likes neighbors, and that while he had the attitude, I don't like neighbors, what he might realize is, I was wrong that I don't like neighbors. It's really that I don't like neighbors that are like annoying assholes. And so I just conflated annoying neighbors with neighbors in general, and mistakenly believed I don't like neighbors. I was actually just wrong about what's in my own interest and what is good or bad relative to my own values on reflection. And that in no way requires us proposing external reasons external to his own desires, because ultimately what's accounting for the shift in his attitude is the discovery that his beliefs about what he liked were misaligned with what it actually turns out he enjoys.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So in sum, the short version of this is that this in no way threatens agent relativism. Relativists can offer perfectly fine explanations about what's going on here psychologically. And so there's no need to appeal to external reasons or posit realism as an explanation for this.
So if we can be externally motivated by normative reasons, then that would mean agent relativism is incorrect and morality is not defined by the individual. Agent relativism also makes morality quite ad hoc. If moral facts depend on the individual, then what is to stop me from changing my moral views tomorrow, depending on what side of the bed I woke up on? If right and wrong is simply dependent on me, then it becomes very arbitrary, and I can simply define morality by what is pleasurable or useful to me, not in any type of internal truth. And I can change this on a whim's notice if I feel like it. In reality, what else would motivate our internal moral truth anyway? Yet, we do not act as if...
Oh boy. Oh boy.
So one question I would have here is, like, what does he mean when he says, like, oh, well, we can change it on a whim's notice? Because, I mean, I guess maybe you could say that in one sense, like, oh, well, it's technically logically possible for, someone to just snap their fingers and older moral attitudes change. But I mean, I don't think in practice, I would suspect that doesn't really seem to be how like human psychology actually works. Like if I'm like disgusted and horrified at the idea of the torturing babies for fun, like I don't think I can just decide like, oh, like I kind of feel like I want to be pro baby torture today, I'm just going to decide to be that. And then the next day, I feel like being anti baby torture today, and I can just change my attitudes on a whim.
Let's just be real here.
This is a very realistic picture.
This is a completely ridiculous picture of human psychology. No one just decides on a whim what their music preferences are, what their food preferences are. We don't decide on our preferences. What the hell? So the worry here is, hey, if you're a relativist, if you're an agent relativist, we all need to be really worried, because what's to stop you from just deciding that you're totally okay with hurting other people or lying or stealing? What's to stop you? Your own damn psychology. What the hell is he talking about? Like, it's not like relativists. People just go, I'm a relativist, so now it's okay for me to do evil. Like, what? That's just, it's not like, I think we're being too hesitant in saying, this isn't plausible. This is absurd. It's absurd. And it's a really, 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 really bad criticism. I mean, among other things, that also just wouldn't make it false. Like, okay, so let's say people can decide what their moral values are on a whim, and that makes their moral values true. Okay, and why does that make the view false? Why would that make it false? That would just mean that like, again, like, what is the objection here? Is this an objection to relativism or an objection to human psychology? Because like relativism isn't right or wrong depending on how unstable human values happen to be. So let's say humans never change their values or preferences. They're fixed at birth and they never change. Now is relativism okay? Now would relativism be okay? Because it would turn out, as a matter of fact, humans actually can't do what he's proposing. Like, why would the truth of relativism turn on contingent facts about human psychology? The answer is it wouldn't. This is nonsense. It's nothing to do with whether relativism is true or not. Now, you might say, okay, well, if we're unsure about the positions, we want to pick one that's intuitively satisfying. It's not intuitively satisfying to suppose that there's a metaethical view about moral truth where someone could just change it on a whim. The problem is like, so someone could change it on a whim. Sure. That doesn't mean that they do. That doesn't have to do with like how we're like analyzing the semantics of ordinary moral discourse. Like first and foremost, let's just suppose we did the semantic analysis of ordinary moral language, and it turns out when people say murder is wrong or stealing is wrong, what they mean is murder violates like is inconsistent with my moral standards. Okay, so now the semantic analysis is that people, let's suppose, speak like some type of relativist. Then we have to ask this I guess metaphysical question. Okay, when they make claims that index to their values, does that fix the moral truth in some metaphysically specific way? What is our guide here? Are normative moral attitudes about that having weird implications, or are prudential attitudes about it being really concerning if people could just fix the moral facts for themselves? Like, what's the methodology here in judging this to be a legitimate, like philosophical objection? It's not clear to me what that's supposed to be. So that's one problem. The other is this is not psychologically realistic. The third is to make a point about realism. So relativists, you might worry about a relativist. Hey, the relativist, if they decide on a whim that it's okay to hurt you, they might hurt you. Okay, but what about realists? If a realist comes to believe it's okay to hurt you, then they might hurt you. So which are more prone to change? Our moral beliefs or our values and preferences, our attitudes? I don't know, but if I had to bet, I'd bet beliefs are more prone to change. And you can point to all the instances in history when people did really morally atrocious things. They thought their actions were morally right or wrong. Do we suppose in all those cases where they did really horrible self-serving things that they were relativists? I don't. Were they realists? I'd probably not. I don't know. But I don't see any particular reason to think that as a matter of like practical fact about human behavior, that relativists are more prone towards unstable moral values than realists. I think that a realist is perfectly capable of shifting their normative moral attitudes. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that seems right. I mean, you can also think of instances. I mean, sometimes you will see people say these things in the context of philosophical like discussions. People sometimes there's this kind of sentiment where people are like, oh, like I really don't like this certain moral conclusion. I really don't want to accept that this is okay, but I guess I have to accept it and just go along with it. And it might be that that sort of sentiment, I would suspect, if I had to guess, is more prevalent among realists than anti-realists.
That seems right. And if that's the case, it could be that I've jokingly called this the metaethical Nuremberg defense, but a moral realist could say something like, look, I don't want to commit this horrible atrocity. It's just that it is morally obligatory. So I'm very sorry, I have to commit it. And then they go ahead and they do something horrible and awful because they are convinced it's objectively the right thing, even though they're cringing and going, ugh, the whole way through. That might be something that can actually happen for the realist. It would be a really weak objection to say that because it's logically possible for realists to do that, well, I guess we better reject realism. But it does parallel this case, which is it's logically possible that people could, if you're a relativist, agent relativist, decide, they wake up in the morning and decide baby torture is okay. That if that's a reason to reject relativism, why isn't the fact that a realist could decide, come to believe that they have to do something horrible in a way where they override or suppress their attitudes, not be a reason to reject realism?
Agreed.
If morality can simply be so arbitrary, or should depend on such personal things. And we understand there are external normative reasons that can motivate us or affect our moral views. So this would most likely infer something like cultural relativism or moral realism is true, and morality is defined by something external to the individual. Speaker relativism has its own issues. If you remember, speaker relativism is different from agent relativism, in that agent relativism focuses on the one performing the action. Speaker relativism cares about the one making the claim.
Okay, so it looks like he's treating speaker relativism as something a bit like appraiser relativism. Does that look right to you?
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
Yeah, we're still not seeing the cultural agent, the individual versus cultural distinction clearly disentangled from the agent appraiser distinction, but we'll see what he does.
In other words, the agent relativist focuses on the person's actions as the moral agent. A speaker relativist focuses on the moral framework as the speaker, who is speaking about another agent's actions. So when I make a moral claim, I'm referring to my moral framework. When you make a moral claim, you're referring to your moral framework. Yet this creates a problem. If I were to say abortion is okay and you said abortion is wrong, then under speaker relativism, there seems to be no shared meaning. Disagreement depends on shared meaning. So for example, if I say a plane flies through the air and you say no it doesn't, but we find out you mean a carpenter's tool, we realize...
Whoa. No shared meaning? No, that's goofy, because if people index claims all the time, the fact that I'm indexing my standards and you're indexing your standards doesn't mean that there's no shared meaning. So I say abortion is right. And what that means is I consider abortion to be morally permissible. And then, someone else says abortion is wrong. And that means I consider abortion to be morally impermissible. Is there a lack of shared meaning there? No. Like, you have these two perfectly consistent statements. Lance thinks abortion is morally permissible. Sam thinks, I'm not going to use you because I don't know what your attitude is and I don't want like a clip of saying you don't approve. Okay, Lance thinks abortion is morally permissible. Sam thinks abortion is not morally permissible. There's not a lack of shared meaning there. So speaker relativists treat moral claims as indexed to the standards of the speaker. This is not a lack of shared meaning. He's misconstruing the problem here. The problem is not a lack of shared meaning. The problem, not exactly. The problem would be a little weird if two people were arguing about what's morally right or wrong. And the problem would be that it looks like the disagreement is like hollow and doesn't make sense. And then you might infer from that if you start with the presumption, people do in fact engage in genuine moral disagreements about what's morally true or false, but all people were actually doing is going around reporting on their own attitudes, they wouldn't really be disagreeing. So if you have two people walk up to each other and I, Lance, think abortion is permissible, and someone else says, I, Sam, think abortion is not permissible. Okay, we're not making different claims about what's true. Both statements are true. I do think it's permissible. They don't think it's permissible. See, two true statements, and they're not like at odds. They're not contradictory statements. It's not like if I said that over there is a tree and someone said, no, that over there is not a tree. So disagreement here is construed as a conflict whereby two or more individuals affirm propositions that are logically contradictory with one another. They couldn't both be true. That's what's taken to be a disagreement. And the idea, I think, that's at the root of this criticism is that if we were speaking like speaker relativists, it would be difficult to make sense of real-world moral disagreement because people really wouldn't be talking across purposes. People act like they do talk across purposes, and so speaker relativism has got to be wrong. You'd have some like modus tollens type argument. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I'm trying to like steel man this, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. That's the argument I typically see.
Actually, I don't have a huge problem with that. Oh, sorry.
But you don't have a huge problem with what?
I don't think people are speaker relativists. And I do think that it would be a little more obvious like if you actually had people drop the implicit indexing of their language and people went around saying stuff, like imagine if I'm like, well, I don't know. I think people would argue anyway. So imagine if I said something like this, where imagine if I say The Matrix is the greatest movie of all time. someone's going to disagree, right? They're going to go, no, it's not. That movie's not the great. Look, that movie was fine in its time, but it's dated and it's not that good. And the sequel sucked. And that kind of spoils the movie for me or whatever. It's trying too hard to be edgy with the stupid leather jackets and sunglasses. It's not that good. They might raise objections, right? But what if I said, I find The Matrix to be the greatest movie of all time? Do you think people would just not bother arguing because they're like, oh, well, Lance is just telling us what he thinks? Imagine I go post that, right? Like I went on social media right now and I said, I consider The Matrix to be the greatest movie of all time. Do you think people would actually read that and go, well, since he's reporting his attitude, there's no legitimate disagreement to be had here. I'll just go about my business. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think people would still fight back against what you're saying. And I think it would even be, I don't think it would be out of the ordinary for someone to explicitly say, oh, I disagree. If you said, I think this movie is great, or I think this movie is terrible, I don't think it would be, even if you explicitly say, I don't think it would be out of the ordinary for someone to respond by saying like, oh, I disagree, I liked it, or I didn't like it.
I 100% agree with you, with your characterization there. Absolutely. People are going to say, they're going to argue with you. They're going to say, as you say, they'd even explicitly say that they disagree. Here is the bottom line. Philosophers have this highly narrow, artificial conception of a disagreement. What they think a disagreement is, and this is because of philosophers thinking in their little philosophy boxes, and like somehow, because look, every philosopher I've ever met has, as far as I know, been a human being. And they've talked to people that are not philosophers. So how philosophers are able to partition off their brains and forget what actual human beings are like I don't understand it. They're just really, really bad at psychology or something. Do they not understand people argue all the time when those people do not think there's an objective fact of the matter? What the hell is wrong with philosophers? So philosophers frame it like this. The way they think a disagreement works is, I go around asserting a proposition, and then you disagree with me when you assert a logically contradictory proposition. I say P. A disagreement is when you say no, not P, or vice versa. That's not the only thing people disagree about. I've given this example before. I'll give it again here. Let's say you're on an island, right? Or no, I'll give a simpler example. It doesn't even have to be an island. Let's say you go to buy a car. You want to pay how much for the car? The most you could pay, the least you could pay, what you consider the objectively fair amount. Like, what are you trying to do when you're buying a car?
Oh, I mean, you're trying to get the lowest price.
Yeah, and the car salesman. Right, you're trying to get the lowest price. What's the salesperson trying to get?
Oh, well, they're going to want whatever makes them the most profit.
Exactly. So you want the lowest price, they want the highest price. Is there a fact about the correct price of the car? Like a stance-independent fact. There is a fact about what the price of the car should be, independent of what you're willing to pay and what they're willing to sell for. No, that's ridiculous. Nevertheless, it makes total sense to say, so you want to buy the car, you're like, look, I'll give you 5,000. They're like 10,000. And you're like, I can't pay that much. You disagree about what the car should be sold for. But there's no fact of the matter about what the car should be sold for. Disagreements can frequently emerge as coordination issues. You want one thing, someone wants some other thing, and you need to compromise or reach some resolution. Another example I give is if a group of friends are trying to order pizza, and you got like one vegan friend and one that hates mushrooms and one that is insisting on double meat or whatever, you all disagree. And so you might come up with a means of resolving the disagreement. If you asked that group of friends, is there an objective fact independent of your food preferences and morality and everything else about what the correct pizza toppings to get? They'd probably think that's no, it's whatever we decided. This is up to us. This is a constructive process. Nothing about disagreement requires a presumption that there be stance-independent facts in play and that the dispute is one of conflicting propositions. There are disagreements. This is the way I put it on my blog. There's disagreements about what's true, but there's also disagreements about what to do. And nothing about two people. I mean, consider morality. One person says, look, I'm not a moral realist, but I want there to be legal access widely available for abortion. And another person goes, look, I'm not a moral realist either. But they say that they're pro-life and they don't want people to have legal access widely available for abortion. They disagree on what the policy ought to be. and they both explicitly don't think there's a fact of the matter, would we say those people just don't disagree with each other? They have nothing to argue about? That's ridiculous. Of course they're going to argue with one another because their goals conflict.
Yeah, I mean, one way I've put it is that disagreement doesn't have to consist in contradictory beliefs. It can also just consist in a clash of attitudes. And that's what you could see, in the moral case between two subjectivists, why it would still make sense to say that they disagree. Even if, like, when they make moral judgments, they're just making a descriptive claim about their attitudes because their attitudes clash.
Yeah. Yeah, I took 10 minutes to say what you took 20 seconds to say. But yeah, so I don't see the problem here.
Realize there is no disagreement because there is no shared meaning. If speaker relativism is true, we cannot ever disagree because we never have shared meaning. What is right for you is not right for me. As Ragnar Francine says, the problem for moral speaker relativism is that it makes moral assertions made by speakers with different morality be about different things, express different propositions, and that they, therefore, do not disagree in the intuitive sense when they are involved in moral disputes.
What the hell is the intuitive sense of disagreement? The intuitive sense, like there's only one sense of disagreement. I don't agree that there is the intuitive sense and that it's a clash of propositions. I don't have that intuition. I think that's very
yeah. I mean, they say intuitive sense. I mean, like, okay, like intuitive to who? Like intuitive to you personally? Intuitive to most people?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's what I stress that a lot because look at how they phrase it. They phrase it in the sort of passive construction, in the intuitive sense. So what you don't have is the author saying, I find this counterintuitive, or I think most people would find this counterintuitive on reflection, or I think most people's sort of gut reaction is this, or I think most people, if they understood what's philosophically at stake here, would hold this view. No, it's intuitive, as though intuitiveness were a feature of propositions, claims, and positions, and not a feature of like psychological facts about people that can and in fact does vary from one person to another. I don't have this intuition. And who the hell are they talking about? So, this is an important thing to push back on when philosophers say, something is intuitive or this is intuitive, is to say intuitive to who? Who are you talking about? And unfortunately, I keep asking this question and none of these philosophers seem to be filling me in on what they think the right answer to that is. They might say, fine, I mean intuitive to me. Okay, then why didn't you say that? Because, I know I make this point a lot, but I'll make it again. I thought analytic philosophy is all about precision. That's not precise language. It's not precise. Why don't they start getting more damn precise? If they're going to pat themselves on the back for how precise they are, get precise. And stop patting yourselves on the back for something you're not even doing. Jesus. I mean, metaethicists can't even get consistent about their terminology. Is it objectivism or realism? Is it stance independence or mind independence or observer independence? Why can't they even figure out what the hell terms they're going to use? Sorry, that's just a whole other aside. But yeah, I don't buy that it's intuitive. Like, when has that been shown? And what does that even mean?
Relativists try to avoid this by attempting to divorce the truth conditions of a sentence with the meaning of a sentence. In other words, the meaning of a sentence doesn't determine the conditions under which it is true. But this seems incorrect, as David Lewis noted. A meaning for a sentence is something that determines the concessions under which the sentence is true or false. If I say, the snakes are alive, but I'm talking in code to relay a hidden message that the enemies are about to attack, the meaning will determine whether or not it is true. We cannot simply divorce truth conditions from meaning. Therefore, if there has to be shared meaning, as speaker relativists have to acknowledge, then this creates a problem, as Andrew Fisher says. If the speaker relativist claims that where people have different moral frameworks, there can be a common meaning, and if meaning determines the truth conditions, then it seems that the speaker relativist is committed to there being common truth conditions across cases of different moral frameworks. But then, of course, it is a mystery why their position should be called relativism. If truth and meaning are not relative to individual moral frameworks, What is left for them to be relative about?
I am not quite sure where he's going. It looks like this looks like a strange pastiche of different sorts of points and notions. There might be an argument here, but it's not clear to me what exactly it is. I think it would take time to like look at the context of these remarks and see how he's trying to put them all together. I'm just not sure what point he's trying to make here.
When he says that speaker relativists, they try to deal with this problem by saying the truth conditions are divorced from the meaning, I'm not really sure what he's talking about there.
I'm not either. I will note he quotes what might be critiques and what look like they are in some cases, but I don't see him actually quoting any speaker relativists. So maybe he should do that. I don't know. Stephen Finlay might be a speaker relativist. Like maybe it's interesting that he opts to quote their critics, but not directly quote what they themselves say. Leaves me a little suspicious. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to do that, but
yeah, I mean, I don't know. The closest I can kind of think of what he's getting at is like that position I mentioned earlier, which is like the new wave relativism, where it's supposed to when one person says something is wrong and another person says something is wrong, it's supposed to express the exact same proposition, but like the truth value of the same proposition can differ, according to each individual person's values. That's like the closest thing I can think of to what he's trying to get at here. But I mean, that doesn't really seem to be.
Sorry.
I was going to say that doesn't really seem to be like especially common form of relativism, at least from what I've seen.
Well, if we just take a standard appraiser relativism, I don't know what is the objection supposed to be, that there's a lack of common meaning? Look, I've always taken appraiser relativism to be something where you can kind of just, as I've done, translate the sentences. You sort of unpack them. So the way I characterize it is like this. When a person says abortion is wrong, on the appraiser relativist framework, that there's an implicit indexical element to what's being stated. And this is how Richard Joyce characterizes relativism. There's an implicit indexical element. So what's a case of an explicit indexical element? Well, that's where you use words that are themselves indexical, like I am Lance, or, well, I am Lance is good enough. You could say I am facing north. There's other sorts of ways. That object is facing north, something like that. I am Lance. So the statement I am Lance is true when I say it, and it's false when people who say it who are not Lance. But that's because that word I specifically is indexing. It's indexing the speaker. So if I say I am Lance, that's true or false relative to like what my actual name is. So it depends on what my name is. So I points to me when I say it, and it points to whoever is saying it when they say it. And so the truth status can vary, but it doesn't vary in a way that undermines common meaning. So it's not like if people went around saying, I am Lance, I am not Lance, I am Lance, I am not Lance, that there's like a lack of common meaning. It's just that there's an indexical element to those speech patterns, and there's no problem with some people being Lance and some people not being Lance. And there's no problem with the statement, I am Lance, being true when some people say it and false when others say it. I see appraiser relativism as doing the exact same thing. It's just that the indexing is done implicitly. So if a person says, abortion is morally permissible, the appraiser relativist just says, hey, look, in parentheses, there's something like I consider it to be, or it is abortion is morally permissible according to my moral standards, or something like that, where the indexing is done, but it's not explicitly stated. And what you would then have if two people said two statements that seem to oppose one another, like I am Lance and I am Lance, that statement can be true when one person says it and false when another says it. Oh no, a big contradiction. No, because the statements actually vary in what they mean. Indexing allows statements to vary in what they mean. And so if our moral statements varied in exactly the same way as the statement, I am Lance, it could be both true and false. Abortion is morally permissible can be both true and false, because when Sam says abortion is morally wrong, it's true relative to Sam's values. And when Alex says that it's not, and they're both, what you have are these two statements. You just translate that statement, abortion is morally wrong. If Alex thinks it is wrong, it's true when Alex says it. If Sam thinks it's not wrong, it's false if Alex were to say that. So you have a statement that just varies in its truth values. There's no semantic problem here of people talking past one another or not expressing something with shared meaning. So I don't know what the hell any of these people are talking about. So that was a very long way of just saying, if what people are doing when they say something is wrong is they're reporting their attitude towards it, this creates absolutely no meaning problems or semantic problems. What you have are people, I report what I value, you report what you value. There's no logical conflicts, there's no contradictions, there's no lack of meaning. Indexing is already a part of English. It's probably a part of most, if not all, languages. There's no problem here. I don't see what the issue is supposed to be.
Yeah, I agree.
Perhaps we have shared meaning for cultural relativism. Perhaps the problem with both agent relativists and speaker relativists.
Oh boy, you were right.
I told you. Yeah, he seems to be like, yeah, he's making a whole bunch of conflations. It's very odd.
Yeah, he seems to think cultural relativism is something other than agent and appraiser relativism, rather than it being the culture individual axis being orthogonal to the agent appraiser axis. That's weird. You were right. He does appear to be conflating them. Oof. That's even I've accused people of conflations or errors and then later discovered that I was wrong and I wasn't being charitable. But this is a case where maybe I was too charitable and they actually are making a mistake. That's bad.
Is they do not realize they get their moral framework from larger cultures that determine truth conditions and meaning in moral frameworks, as well as explain why there are external normative reasons that motivate us. Remember that cultural relativism teaches that morality is defined by the culture. Individuals get their moral views from a larger culture, which defines the moral framework for individuals in these cultures. And perhaps this is correct, as it appears morality does differ from culture to culture. In the West, we prize equal rights for men and women, whereas in parts of Africa, women are often treated as second-class citizens. In traditional Christian cultures, abortion is perceived to be wrong, whereas in more secular cultures, abortion is perceived as neither good or bad. So perhaps morality is defined by the culture. Well, the problem with this line of thinking is, as we have already noted in our defense of moral realism, cultural disagreements do not necessarily mean morality is subjective, for the same reason different beliefs about the age of the earth does not mean science is subjective. There is a real world out there we can discover, and certain humans are only in error when they miscalculate the age of the earth. Moral facts and duties may be objectively true, and cultural differences may just mean certain cultures are better at understanding objective moral facts and duties, whereas some are simply incorrect in their moral assessments of the facts. Second, cultures tend to have wide agreement on values and duties, and the actual differences seem to lie in underlying factual misconceptions. If one tribe thinks it is okay to kill members of a neighboring tribe, it usually is from an underlying factual belief about the humanity of the other tribe. Like that the other tribe is not fully human and that they are really demons or monsters. If you can convince the first tribe the other tribe is just as human as they are, they tend to change their view on if they should be killed off or not. Moral differences between cultures tend to be based on factual errors, not actual value differences. See my video on moral realism for a better explanation of moral convergence. So the existence of different cultural views on morality doesn't actually count as evidence for moral relativism. Plus, cultures are typically hard to define. Where are the governing lines that separate cultures? And when do they apply? What if a Muslim family from China moves to America? What cultural morality should they be subject to? Their family, their origin, or the current culture they live in? Where exactly are the lines?
That is not a good objection, because one could just, it's still presuming that there's like a distinct set of norms that they're like obligated to comply with, rather than that you could say for a particular family, let's say they move from one country to another, you could say their actions are right relative to the host country's culture, but wrong relative to the original country's culture. What's the problem with that? Like you could just evaluate them relative to different standards. And if they were to speak, you could ask them, hey, which set of values are you referring to? I don't see what the problem is there. It's like he's imagining that there's like a canonical culture that has to be binding on each individual or something. And that we have to figure out which one it is.
The thing he said about the differing moral judgments of cultures, well, really that's a matter of just factual disputes, not actual value differences. I mean, I'm not really sure how true that is. I mean, that seems to be like you'd have to provide, it seems like there'd have to be some sort of, psychological evidence presented for a claim rather than just like asserting it. He doesn't really, provide any like source for why he thinks that. It's just kind of like an assertion he makes.
Yeah, it's true. He makes an empirical claim there and he provides no evidence for it, which is a little weird because I know that IP in like history videos and other videos he provides a whole lot of sources and texts and evidence. But here he seems perfectly comfortable making a claim and providing literally no evidence at all. Strange.
I don't
lines dividing cultural morality. At the regional level, national, village, family, where exactly does a cultural set of moral values begin and end? What if a man from culture A has sex with a woman from culture B in a country where culture C is present? By what cultural morality are they judged by? If you say there are some kind of external rules which govern these cultural divides and decide where different cultural moral views apply, how is that not setting an objective standard we must abide by, beyond the cultural norms? If truth and meaning are not relative to cultural moral frameworks, what is left for them to be relative about?
Whoa, if truth and meaning, does he mean specifically moral truth and meaning or truth and meaning in general? What the heck was that about? 1 second.
Objective laws we must abide by, beyond the cultural norms. If truth and meaning are not relative to cultural moral frameworks, what is left?
What is he talking about?
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't specify moral truth and meaning. He just says truth and meaning.
That's it.
I mean,
okay,
maybe he's just taking that to be implicit.
Yeah, I really hope so, because if he's not, then he's mixed up moral relativism with like global relativism. I can't imagine that he's mixed those two up. So it just has to be implicit and intended here if moral truth and moral meaning are not relative. But you really got to make that explicit to avoid that potential misunderstanding.
I mean, I will say I have seen people before criticizing relativism, and sometimes they will go with the strange objection where they'll be like, oh, like, these relativists, they're supposed to be criticizing moral relativism, but then they'll say things like, well, it's actually self-defeating because they want to say moral relativism is non-relatively true. And it's like, well, I mean, moral relativism is about the truth of, first order moral claims. It's not about metaethical moral claims. But I have seen that on more than one occasion. People will try and like use that as a gotcha against moral relativists.
I've seen it. I don't think he's doing that here. I think this is just a little imprecise language. I do know these are older videos from him. And given that, I think a lot of the phrasing here is not great. Like at some point he says like, from this fact, he says something like it infers that, which is like weird phrasing as though facts infer things, but people infer things. Facts don't infer things. It's a weird way to phrase things. So he has a few ways where he phrases things in awkward, ambiguous, or unclear ways that I think if I were reviewing this a couple of years ago, I would have been a bit more of a jerk and just assumed he was making more mistakes than he's making. I don't think he's making that mistake, and in a few other cases, I don't think he's making what could be mistakes and remind me of mistakes other people are making. It just, the language here needs some cleaning up. I think he could have used a better script for the video. So I would recommend that he redo the video and clean it up at least, and maybe check out our review of it and maybe address our criticisms. That'd be great. I'd love some interaction and feedback. I don't expect it. I think I've critiqued Inspiring Philosophy at least a couple times, and he's shown no interest even when I've contacted him with interacting, which is fine. You know, people are busy. I'm not a super high status person, so fair enough. But I would appreciate some back and forth, just because it'd be great to get some reactions to my critiques, especially if there's places to correct me, because there's no way, you know, I mean, maybe everything you said is perfectly accurate, but I know I make mistakes. So there's a good chance. And this isn't just me being humble. I've had a couple cases of like embarrassing and specific mistakes that I made in interpreting people where I'm like, yeah, I screw up. So that's totally possible. And I'd like to know about that at the very least. But again, I don't expect it. I'm going to predict that won't happen. But we're closing in on the end of this. Did you have more to say about this part, or should we try to wrap it up?
No, I have nothing to add about this.
Okay, I'm going to try to wrap it up before the 2-hour mark, so we'll see if I can get there.
Left for them to be relative about. Objective laws which govern and divide morality into different cultures is a form of moral realism, where values and facts are decided not on what the culture sets, but on governing principles not decided by humans. The other issue is cultural relativism suffers from something known as the reformer's dilemma. If cultural relativism is true, then it is logically impossible for a society to have a virtuous moral reformer, like Gandhi or Dr. King. The idea behind reforms as a culture or society is no longer conforming to the objective moral law, and therefore needs to change. If cultural relativism is true, then these men were not virtuous. They were...
It's just you know, it's almost like a emotional extortion. It's like saying, hey, do you want to say that the things that Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Did were good? Well, then you can't be a relativist. You can't do it, or you got to think they're bad. Even if a relativist has a response to this, I mean, there's as much rhetoric behind this as there is a substantive philosophical objection. You don't have to pick those specific examples. They're chosen in a way that is suspiciously rhetorically convenient. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
Or an error for going against the culture.
You have something to say on that?
No.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, it's just, why did they got to go for these examples that imply if you hold this anti-realist view, then you're saying like Martin Luther King Jr. is bad or something like that. They all just, I see this so often. And again, it's a question of like, maybe there are, a relativist might not have a good response to that. I think they probably can respond to this fairly easily. But whether or not they could, I do find it interesting that critics of anti-realist positions don't stick to the abstract considerations. They lean very, very heavily on giving the impression that anti-realist views carry horrific normative moral implications.
Yeah, well, I mean, you'll note that he says, oh, like a cultural relativist can't say that these people were virtuous. But I mean, that's going to be relativized, you know. You can't say they're, like, presumably they're not going to say they're virtuous objectively. But I mean, you could say they're virtuous relative to this culture, or virtuous relative to like our culture now.
You could,
so I don't know. He seems to be embedding kind of a normative element into it. I guess there is kind of a question of you could like get rid of that normative element. And you could just ask the question of, I guess there could be the concern of, you know, when you have these reformers, I mean, for kind of like a modern example, like you could look to like animal rights activists or like pro-life activists or any kind of like activist group that's trying to change society. I mean, I guess you could ask the question, you know, when these groups say this is wrong, are they really saying that, you know, this is wrong relative to the standards of our culture, that our culture like disapproves of abortion or factory farming or whatever it is?
Yeah, so and they're probably not saying that. It'd be really weird for people in a society that has a lot of factory farming saying, our society disapproves of factory farming. No, it doesn't. That's the problem. So, you know, they could say something like, look, I understand that it's not wrong relative to this culture to engage in factory farming, but we don't like it and we want you to stop doing it. At that point, what is there a contradiction? Is it impossible? You could say, if those people are culture relativists, or if you're a culture relativist, that their actions are not good relative to that culture. So what? They're still good relative to, say, your values or your preferences, or you could say they are good relative to the culture they ended up creating. Those are at the same time consistent with one another. So Gandhi and Martin Luther King bring about reforms. They become the cultural norm, and so their actions were good relative to the new culture and bad relative to the old culture. So that's how a culture relativist can handle this. Here's what I don't like about these sorts of scenarios. The implication is that if you're a relativist, this has something to do, this tells us something about your attitudes of approval or disapproval. So if we say Gandhi's actions were inconsistent with the moral standards of the culture at his time, and therefore they were morally wrong relative to that culture. Let's say you're a culture relativist and you're committed to that. His actions were technically speaking wrong, remember, relative to that culture. Because if you're a relativist, you cannot and do not think that they're wrong in some non-relative way. You think they're wrong relative to that culture. Okay, and what follows from that? The implication here has something to do, it's implied, if you're a cultural relativist, then you would have to be opposed to Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr.'s reforms. But that's not an implication of cultural relativism. The culture I'm a part of treats them as people that did heroic, awesome, great things. So their actions are good relative to my culture. So why would it matter with respect to my own attitude of approval and my own actions, whether their actions are wrong relative to their cultures at the time? So, like, again, there's the constant insinuation that your attitudes of approval and disapproval, your feelings as a cultural relativist, somehow have to trail or dovetail with the cultural zeitgeist of the time in which the reformer existed. And that's just not an entailment of cultural relativism. So I think that there's normative entanglement going on here. There's an implication that the relativist is a no good, bad, naughty person that's not actually entailed by this. Oh, look at that. Someone said this in the chat. Yeah, this is a case of normative entanglement. All right. Anything for you to say, or we got 2 minutes left, but you're welcome to jump in too, of course.
No, I don't. I guess the only thing I would say is just what I said earlier. I mean, I think the way he's running it here, it does involve normative entanglement, but there is kind of like an objection I think you could make related to informer or reformers that I don't think involves normative entanglement, which is just that, you know, insofar as cultural relativism, if it's making a semantic claim that when people make moral statements, they're making statements about, you know, what their culture approves of or disapproves of. It seems strange to say that, you know, animal rights activists or pro-life activists, you know, when they say, you know, factory farming is wrong or abortion is wrong, that they're talking about like what their culture disapproves of. They're saying their culture disapproves of those actions.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So if the thesis, if the semantic thesis is something like when people make moral claims, those people just are making claims about what's right or wrong relative to their cultures, then if it's like civil rights issues are considered wrong relative to a culture, and someone were to go around saying, no, they're not wrong, we deserve civil rights and equality or whatever, those statements are false relative to that culture, if you're a culture relativist. And you might think, okay, well, that's weird. So you might reflect and go, okay, well, they couldn't mean that then. And so if it's the case that they couldn't mean that, then the semantic thesis is wrong. So it's not the case that they were trying to do that. So, because after all, if there's a society that is like, pro-slavery or something horrible, and then a person says slavery is wrong, it'd be really weird to say, so you're saying slavery is, that your culture disapproves of slavery? Because the reaction to that person would be like, no, clearly they do. That's what I don't like. So you could raise this as an objection to cultural relativism as a semantic thesis about what everybody means. I don't know how a cultural relativist would handle that. So if cultural relativism is treated as this like global semantic thesis, it does seem like it would do a bad job of explaining what these people were trying to say in the relevant contexts. And in that respect, I think fair enough. Of course, I don't endorse it, so not really a problem for me. But I also just don't think that we should be supposing that everyone everywhere all the time is going to be, when they make moral claims, that they're indexing the same standards in the first place. So I just wouldn't endorse these theses on the grounds of presumption of uniformity and determinacy anyway. In other words, I wouldn't buy into any of these positions that think when anybody makes a moral claim, they're expressing the same metaethical stance as everybody else. That would be a really weird thing to think about moral language, that everyone's got to mean the same thing, metaethically speaking. So in that respect, maybe that serves as some kind of decent criticism. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add besides that.
For moral norms. As Emery's Westacott says, moral relativism seems to imply, for instance, that the majority can never be wrong on moral matters, and a corollary of that is that within a given community, dissidents must always be wrong. So cultural relativism cannot account for reforms or reformers, because to call for moral reform requires a vantage point outside and above the culture's moral norms from which to judge they are wrong. But it is exactly such a vantage point that cultural relativism denies. Even many advocates of moral relativism end up creating an objective standard by promoting the virtue of tolerance. Not all moral relativists, but many preach we must be tolerant of other cultures. This is an underlying foundation for many people holding to moral relativism, that we must be tolerant of different ideas. But the idea of tolerance of different moral views is preached as if it is a universal obligation. If relativism is true, then the principle of tolerance doesn't express a transcultural obligation that is binding on everyone. In other words, it is merely an expression of values associated with one culture or relative framework. Pragmatically speaking, if the relativist preaches tolerance should be abided by everyone, and everyone should respect different cultural moral views, they are pushing an objectively binding moral value. But they cannot if it is all relative. What if it is someone's cultural norm to reject tolerance and moral views of other cultures, and seek to install their own moral framework on everyone? So basically, if you think everyone should be tolerant of other moral frameworks, you are not promoting relativism, but a universal obligation. These issues and more cause problems for moral relativists, and seem to suggest the evidence.
I will say, I don't think that is a good objection to like a philosophically self-aware conception of cultural relativism, because they're just not going to endorse that. But I do think this objection is worth making anyway. And I think it's worth making anyway because in practice, so many people seem to hold views that are in tension with one another. So nominally, they appear to be some type of anti-realist that says there's no stance-independent or objective moral values. And then on the other hand, they have this view about how we all have an obligation to tolerate one another that they do seem to treat in practice like it's not dependent on one's culture. And so I have run into this myself, and I've seen it, where there do appear to be people that hold these contradictory positions. Note, though, that's not a good objection to cultural relativism. That's an objection to a specific set of beliefs that many relativists have that conflict with relativism. So, like, if I pointed out many theists are like, let's suppose for whatever reason, lots of Christians were like really bad at logic, that wouldn't be a good argument against Christianity. It would be a reason to like say, hey, some Christians are bad at logic. So this is just a silly hypothetical. That's not even true at all. So if it turns out lots of cultural relativists tend to hold realist views, that's not a great objection to relativism itself. It can still be leveraged to be an objection against relativism, though. One thing you can point out about relativism is that, as a matter of fact, like a lot of the people that think it's appealing, like its apparent intellectual merits, run up against what people are naturally disposed to think and believe anyway. And insofar as that's true, I don't have a huge problem with saying there's something that's like a bit of a red flag about the view, that it seems to conflict with our natural dispositions. Not a huge one. It's not decisive by any means, but it's something.
I mean, I will say it is kind of important, though, to be clear that, if someone, has an attitude of tolerance and they think others have like an obligation to be tolerant of other cultures, that normative position itself doesn't necessarily conflict with cultural relativism. Because, it could be the case that you just live in a culture that preaches tolerance, and you're just abiding by your culture's norms. And when you say people should be tolerant, you're just making a statement like about your own culture's norm. I don't know how true, like how many people in practice who preach tolerance, if that's what they're actually doing, but that is what someone could be doing. And it is also like noteworthy, maybe inspiring philosophy should have a conversation with some of the other critics of relativism, because it is kind of funny, because depending on the critic of relativism, when it comes to the issue of tolerance, like there'll be two different objections. You'll have some critics, they'll attack relativism by saying, oh, if relativism is true, we have to tolerate other cultures who do all these terrible things. They do human sacrifice or whatever. So there will be people who attack it on those grounds, that it entails tolerance. And then there'll be people who attack it on like the opposite basis. Oh, like relativism can't account for tolerance. So it is kind of funny that you see people take those two differing lines on relativism and tolerance.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I would like to see IP engage more with metaethics. I haven't seen them do it in a while. I think we're about at the end of this. Let's see.
Pointing towards the idea, there is an objective moral reality that is not defined by cultures, societies, or individuals. Relativism may be popular among modern laymen, but it suffers from serious logical difficulties that simply cannot be...
I don't even know if that's true, that it's popular among laymen.
I don't know if it is either. Which layman is it popular among? I mean, there's the Pulsar and Wright data, which shows that relativism, both individual and cultural relativism, were very popular among the participants in their studies. I don't know how much those findings generalize to people as a whole, though.
Okay.
And also, I'm skeptical of the validity of those measures in the first place. Okay, so that was the video. What's your overall take? Was that a good critique of relativism?
I did not find it particularly convincing, I have to say. I mean, there were just a lot of really bad objections. Which is kind of, I mean, to be honest, par for the course. Like a lot of the objections to relativism And really, anti-realist views in general are kind of stunningly bad, I've noticed. And it's not just among laymen either. Like, even among professional philosophers, when I read some of like the objections to these individual anti-realist views, I'm like looking there at what I'm reading. I'm like, does anyone find this convincing? I don't see like why anyone would find this compelling.
Yeah, I have the same reaction. And what's especially frustrating about this is that I find myself defending the sort of traditional anti-realist views, expressivism, non-cognitivism, or sorry, same thing, expressivism, relativism, error theory, even though I don't endorse any of these views. And I think in all three cases, the primary objections to these views turn on the features of those views that are the reason why I reject them in the first place. Maybe cultural relativists do run into like really weird issues if they insist on proposing cultural relativism as an explanation for like how everyone is speaking. But why on earth, if you're going to say, hey, I really don't think that there are stance independent moral facts, would you couple that with the view that when people make moral claims, they all are reporting on what's right or wrong relative to their cultures? Why would you think that? I don't think that. I think that's a silly view. So, you know, there's a sense in which I like kind of agree with inspiring philosophy. I think cultural relativism is a very implausible view insofar as it's understood to be a characterization of how people speak, if that's what the view is. But like, why not just say that? Like, why not say, hey, traditional cultural relativism includes a semantic thesis. The thesis is that moral claims express facts about what's right or wrong relative to particular cultures. Is there any indication that that's what people mean when they make moral claims? No, not really. So cultural relativists haven't really sustained a case that their position is correct, that they've accurately characterized ordinary moral semantics. If they would like to, let's wait and see the evidence that they have. Oh, they don't have any? Okay, bye, cultural relativists. Come back when you have some damn evidence. Why don't they do that? Because that's what I do. Like it's the like obvious easiest move. Imagine if I said 100% of people love spam. They love the taste of spam. They eat it all the time. I think it'd be pretty weird to say, well, that would be really, it's hard to account for that because you can, like, sometimes you'll hear people say things like, I don't like spam. Why would you like start speculating from the armchair instead of just saying 100% of people? So if I could find a person that hates spam and won't eat it, you're wrong. Like what? Like there's got to be easier ways, even than the sort of traditional objections to these views. They make weird semantic claims. I think it's like if you want to show that those are wrong, like run a survey. I get like why wasn't anyone ever motivated to do this? There's just something strange about the entire setup of these arguments, both the people making the arguments and the people like responding to them. I also want to note about the video. We didn't hear, as far as I recall, from any relativist, did we? Did he ever quote or characterize any specific person or people's views?
Not that I recall. I mean, it seemed like all the quotes were of critics of relativism.
Something about that seems off to me. Does it? Like, imagine if I was critiquing like the existence of the historical Jesus, and the only thing I ever did was quote like mythicists. Like it'd be a little weird because it might make you think, okay, well, maybe the people I'm criticizing have better things to say than what you're doing. Like he doesn't name names. Is this just nebulous? Like it's like this nebulous blob of idiots that he's criticizing, rather than some like strong representative of the view. In contrast, all the critics he brings up, he's like, according to this person from this book, it just seems kind of like a skewed presentation of the back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, also, like, lots of times when you see people going after anti-realism, I kind of see this a lot. They'll be like, here's, like, this one objection to, I don't know, whatever it is, subjectivism. Oh, there can't be moral disagreement. And that's that. There'll be, like, there'll be no, oh, and here's what subjectivists say in response to this objection. And here's why I don't find their response to be compelling. Like a lot of times they don't even bother with that. They just kind of present the objection as if like that settles it. It's like a slam dunk case. There's nothing else subjectivists could possibly say in response to it.
That seems right. The sense I get is that critics of anti-realist views seem to regard them with such contempt and regard the views as such intellectually bankrupt, silly, indefensible views that their job is the task of cleaning up a misconception, almost like they're dealing with like flat earthers or something. It's like, look, these idiots think the earth is flat. Here's 2 or 3 reasons how, of course, we know it's round. Moving on. Like, who cares what the flat earther has to say? They're idiots. We don't need to hear the rebuttal to that. It seems like they treat anti-realist views like relativism and expressivism the same way. Oh, you're an expressivist? Well, frega geach problem. You're done. Bye, idiot. Error theory, that would imply Holocaust not wrong. What an idiot. Moving on. Like, this is how humor seems to treat it. Like, humor has like a 1 minute. Humor says something like this. He's like, okay, well, we can show that realism is true by process of elimination. Obviously, if anti-realism isn't true, then realism is true because it's just the negation of it. Okay, so let's go through. There's only 3 possible anti-realist positions. There's error theory that claims that all moral claims are not true. So if that's the case, then it's not the case that it's true that torturing babies is wrong. Well, that's obviously absurd. So error theory is wrong. If you're an expressivist, then moral claims can't be true or false. That would mean that it's not true that torturing babies is wrong. That's ridiculous. Expressivism is wrong. Moving on. If you're a relativist, then you think moral claims are true or false relative to different cultures. So if there's a culture or individuals, so if there's a culture or individual that thinks baby torture is good, then it is good. That's ridiculous. Relativism is false. I've shown all 3 of the only logically possible anti-realist positions can't be true. By process of elimination, realism wins. Realism proved. That he does that as if that's the whole dialectic. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's like they're so impatient to just go, just shove it in a corner, shut up the anti-realists. Like they're not worth talking to. And I often get this vibe from realists. Like I don't get realists emailing me often wanting to set up debates or have discussions. And when I do, it seems like I'm at arm's length, like they're willing to talk to me. But I do, and maybe I'm projecting, maybe I'm imagining it, but I do feel like I'm sitting in the seat of a person that's treated like we might treat like a flat earther or something. Like that, it's like, oh, fine, I'm willing to get down in the mud and talk to this weirdo Lance that might have brain damage and might be a psychopath about his silly view. That's what it feels like to me. What about for you?
Yeah, I mean, there doesn't really seem to be a lot of the time serious engagement with the views. A lot of it is just like, oh, well, this view is obviously false. We don't even have to like spend any time on this. It's just obviously wrong. But then also like a lot of the reasons they think the views are obviously wrong are like also based on misunderstandings of the view. Like they haven't even taken, a lot of the times they haven't even taken the time to actually understand the view in question before, dismissing it as obviously wrong.
Yeah.
Like I saw one person, I mean, you see it a lot with relativism where people say, oh, like, it implies like tolerance. Is a very common critique. It's like, well, no, it doesn't, not necessarily. Then with error theory, I mean, I've seen some really bad critiques of error theory. Like there's one guy, and this person wasn't just some random layman. It was a person with formal training in philosophy who said, oh, if error theory is true, then torturing people is permissible. And it's like, no, it doesn't say that it's
literally
permissible.
Not true. It's neither permissible, it's neither objectively permissible nor impermissible. Like that's the implication. Yeah, in those cases, they appear to be operating under the misconception that the negation of, like if you think it's not morally wrong, that therefore you think it's morally permissible, when you just think it's not even in the ball game at all, of being morally right or wrong. That's as ridiculous as saying, hey, if you're an atheist, then you don't think that God disapproves of any of your actions. So therefore, you think God approves of anything you do, even killing people. And it's like, well, no, I don't think God approves or disapproves of anything, you idiots. So yeah, but I have seen that where people will say error theorists think all actions are morally permissible. No, they don't.
Yeah,
that's ridiculous.
There's also a there was this clip I saw which I found kind of amusing, which was Emerson Green had humor on his podcast or show or whatever. And like Emerson Green, one of the things he says, they're talking about metaethics. And Emerson Green says, anti-realist positions, I mean, the thing with them is the positions are so ridiculous that when you just accurately describe them, it sounds like you're strawmanning them. That's just how crazy they are. And then when he goes on to describe the views, he literally just like strawmans them, doesn't represent them accurately.
I have a vague memory of having that reaction. Like he's like, well, it seems like you're strawmanning them even when you're not, and then he strawmans them. But I don't remember exactly what he said. But I haven't been able to have an effective, like a productive back and forth with Emerson about metaethics. It was probably my comments in one of those videos, and it might even be that like where humor runs through the like, there's only 3 anti-realist views, they're all wrong, so realism is true. Because I remember Emerson commenting, and I think he might even have a pinned comment from himself or something saying like summarizing the video or something. But he says, like he just accepts as if humor is the saint of metaethics, like Humer's claim, which Humer makes in Ethical Intuition, is his book, arguing for that view, that there's only 3 possible types of anti-realism. This just isn't true. It's just not true that there's only 3 forms of anti-realism. Because if you take those 3 forms of anti-realism, they all center on a specific semantic thesis that holds that like moral claims are propositional, moral claims are non-propositional, and then among the ones that are propositional and purport to be objective or are not objective. I don't endorse any of those views. There's no logical contradiction in that because I'm not logically required to think that there's a category of moral claim that all exhibit the same, like a shared semantics. I don't have to think that. So it's very weird. And I tried pointing out there's like pluralist positions, there's incoherentist positions, there's indeterminacy views. If you're a pragmatist, you might have a different view, but I didn't point that one out. But like you could be some kind of deflationist, you could be a quasi-realist, you could be like, I don't know. You have a variety of views. For speaking for myself, I just don't share the semantic presuppositions behind the traditional categories. But I wasn't able to get anywhere with him. There was a little bit of a back and forth, and then he stopped communicating with me about it. And I've never understood why, but I have noticed from him a kind of, what struck me as a kind of dismissiveness towards anti-realists. Like he just doesn't want to be bothered to have to engage with them. And I do find that, I find it disappointing and frustrating, and also kind of a bummer because I don't get to engage with realists. It seems like they just don't want to talk to me, at least many of them. And I'm not sure why.
Yeah, I don't know.
So what got you into doing this? Like critiques of the anti-realist stuff? I mean, sorry, of the realist stuff.
I don't know. I mean, I've just kind of, well, for a long time, I've been thinking it like in the kind of like back of my head, like for a long time, including before I would even know what like the term metaethics is. I would see, kind of discourse among laymen about like, oh, is morality objective? Is it subjective? And I would just see these critiques. Whenever anyone said it was subjective, people would, do the normative entanglement and would just have all these really bad objections. And I remember thinking, like, as a 15 or 16-year-old, like, wow, these are just really bad. This is like, it obviously doesn't imply tolerance. Like, how could you even think that? So I've always kind of taken issue with it. And then at some point later, when I started getting more into philosophy and actually studying metaethics and reading about it more, I just kind of felt the need, there are so many like bad objections to these views that I kind of just like want to say something about it, especially since it seems like really rare to see anyone kind of like saying, oh, like, no, this is not right. This, because you just see it like said so often. These things about relativism or other anti-realist views, they're just like there's really bad objections repeated like uncritically, and I just have some like urge, like I have to say something about this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're both fighting a good fight. I'm glad more people are doing this. It's, for me, I vacillate. Sometimes I'm real amped up about it, but sometimes I get discouraged because it seems like I'm always making the same points over and over and over, and it's hard to see those changes. What I also find really strange about it is I don't see a lot of anti-realists effectively responding to realists. They often seem to like just buy into the way realists frame things, and I do find that frustrating.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So okay, well, we'll keep fighting the good fight. I'm happy to review more videos with you, but I'm also happy to do ones that aren't on metaethics. I'm not telling you like, hey, hint, hint, you got to do that. I'm happy to do more metaethics, but I'm also down for reviewing other stuff too.
All right. I guess that's it then.
Yeah. All right. Very cool. Okay. So for people on my channel, I gotta make, I need like a, what's the lines you say when you're closing things out. I need that. But anyway, like,
yeah, I never know how to end videos.
Neither do I. I mean, I have a video for it, but I'll just encourage people, like my video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I do have I have a Linktree link. So the Linktree link will take you to all my other stuff. I got a blog. I'm on TikTok. I got like an academic site on there. I don't know. There's other stuff. Go check it out. I'm on like Blue Sky. I'm not on Twitter, but I'm on Blue Sky. I got a Discord. You can check out my Discord. I got Patreon if you want to do that. So there's all sorts of ways to support me. But Travis also has a channel. So go over there, subscribe to that channel, like the videos over there, comment on the videos. I always encourage comments. Feel free to jump in and comment, even if you think I'm a big stupid head and you want to say that. I'm happy to engage, or at least read your comment and feel bad. So I do read the comments. A lot of people don't. I do, even if it hurts my soul, and I feel bad about it, but I do it anyway. So that's a weird way to end things. That I masochistically, subject myself to the horrible things some of you might end up saying to me, but it's mostly positive comments. So anyway, go check out Travis's channel.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, the channel is Travis Talks 2. The 2 is, it's not the number 2, it's spelled out. So I used to have a Twitter by the same name, which got suspended, but there's another Twitter that you should check out called Not Travis Talks, which definitely is not me. And then I also have a Substack that's just Travis Talks, no hyphens or anything like that for any of them. But yeah, besides that, I don't have anything else to say.
Cool. Okay. If you send me links to stuff, any links you want me to put in the description, I can update the description to throw those in there. So we'll figure that out later. But great. So go check out all that stuff. And yeah. Okay. So I have my outro video now. So I'll do an outro video because the outro, that's what it's called. The word was in front of me. How do we? Wow. Okay. All right. I'm done for the night. All right. See y'all later, everybody. Like the stuff.